the seven churches in Revelation, what the Spirit says to the churches. We've talked through we've talked through four so far, and what we found is that Jesus was writing letters to churches that were in an idolatrous society, that were being confronted with a Roman ruler, a Roman Caesar, who was claiming to be God, and so he's issuing a call that he is superior, he is victorious, and that he is above the society that they're in. He's above the ruler at the time, and so we'll see that message continues here. His letters, we're going to study through Revelation chapter 3. Essentially, these three congregations, Sardis, Philadelphia, and Laodicea, are Revelation chapter 3. And what we'll see is that the letters each follow a format, and that kind of gives us insight into what specifically he's saying to each congregation. He'll say to the angel, or like we've established already, it's not really an angel like a hovering angel, it's the messenger, the one who would read the letter aloud. To the messenger or angel of the church in the location, right? And the one who, and Jesus will describe himself in typically some powerful way, says this. He appears to John on the island of Patmos, and he, in a very, very powerful way, he's got a big white robe, a sash, feet like burnished bronze, eyes that are shooting out like fire, a sword coming out of his mouth, white hair, that's a picture of power, right? And so he does this, and so he'll describe himself in one of those ways. He who has this powerful characteristic says this, right? To call himself as more powerful than Caesar. I know your deeds, and he'll say some good things that the congregation has been doing, and then he'll say, but I have this against you in some cases. Things that they were lacking. And then he says to him who overcomes, and he'll give a description of, if they hold to the truth, if they hold to their allegiance to Jesus, then they'll receive some promise of that victory. And then he concludes with, he who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. And so the three that we're going to talk about are we're kind of finishing our road, right? John was on the island of Patmos when he had this vision of Jesus, and then there was this circular trade route. And so we've gone through Ephesus. Ephesus was a congregation that had all their teaching, all their rules in the right place, but their heart, they had lost their first love. Smyrna was a congregation that he didn't have anything against, but he said, you're going to undergo persecution, some of you, to the point of death, and that prophecy came true. Then there's Pergamum, and he said this is where Satan's throne was, and we saw that this was an altar upon which they would offer Christians, they would offer sacrifices to idols, to Zeus and Athena, I think they were. They would offer sacrifices, and one of those sacrifices was one of the elders at that congregation. And then we talked about Thyatira, which was a congregation that he said their good works were increasing, right? So they were on the right path, but they had a cancer in that congregation. That cancer was a false teacher named Jezebel, who was leading people into idolatry rather than into the truth. And so he said, you need to get rid of that, otherwise your congregation will die. And so we're going to conclude with Sardis, Philadelphia, and Laodicea. These are congregations you might not be as familiar with. They're not as well known as some of the other cities. Kind of the key cities in the region were these. But what we'll see is there's some interesting things Jesus writes to each of them. First, we'll go to Revelation 3, and we'll read verses 1 through 6. And this is Jesus' letter to Sardis. Right? So Jesus' letter to Sardis. To the angel of the church in Sardis write, he who has the 7 spirits of God and the 7 stars says this, I know your deeds, that you have a name, that you're alive, but you're dead. Wake up and strengthen the things which remain, which are about to die, for I have not found your deeds completed in the sight of God. So remember what you've received and heard, and keep it and repent. Therefore, if you do not wake up, I will come like a thief, and you will not know at what hour I will come to you. But you have a few people in Sardis who have not soiled their garments, and they will walk with me in white, for they are worthy. He who overcomes will thus be clothed in white garments. And I will not erase his name from the book of life. I will confess his name before my Father and before his angels. He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. Right? So we want to have that ear. We want to have that ear to find out what Jesus says to the church at Sardis, and to the kind of he speaks, as we've established so far. He speaks to the local history, and that's the case here with Sardis as well. Sardis, prior to the Roman Empire, was the capital of the Lydian Empire, right? And so to be a capital, you have to be a city that's powerful, well-funded, and Sardis was a wealthy city. And so for about 600 years, from roughly 1200 BC to around 600 BC, Sardis was the capital of this prior empire that then succumbed to the Greek and Roman empires. And the city is actually surrounded by, spoiler alert, the city is surrounded by cliffs. Let me skip ahead. So the city is surrounded by cliffs. This is the Acropolis for the city. And it's surrounded by cliffs, so it had a very good natural defense system. The thing I skipped by was that they also had a natural supply of gold near the city, a natural supply of silver near the city. And this, this doesn't look like modern coins, but Sardis was the place in the world where coinage, in terms of gold and silver coins, was invented. Right. So see, these are some of the first gold and silver coins that ever existed, and they were under the last king. The last Lydian king named Croesus. And I guess there's a phrase called rich as Croesus. I've never heard it before, but I guess it's a common phrase. And that's because King Croesus was known for his wealth. Like we might think of Solomon was known for his wisdom and wealth. Right? King Croesus, or Midas, Croesus was known for his wealth, and he was the last king of Sardis. And so also in the city of Sardis, you've heard of like Aesop's fables. Aesop was born and lived in Sardis. So Sardis was actually sieged just after 600 BC, right? And so you might think, how could someone siege a city like this? A city that's built on hill, or that even Croesus used his wealth to kind of build a wall around the city, right? So if you're going to attack a city like this, what would you do? Well, actually, Cyrus the Persian, here's another view of that city, and down here is the Temple of Artemis. So Cyrus, what he did was he laid siege to the city. So, right, if you can't overtake the walls, I'll just surround it. But he couldn't find a way in until one day, one of his soldiers noticed there was a soldier, and I'm not sure of the specific place, but there was a soldier up on the wall around the city. And it was a soldier, a soldier in Sardis, and he looked over and dropped his helmet. Right, this is how the story or legend goes for the overtaking of Sardis. He dropped his helmet, and so what the Persian soldiers noticed is that the soldier went down and either came out through like a hidden door or found this way through the craggy rocks, got his helmet, and went back up. And so what they realized is there's a secret entrance to the city. And so around 550 BC, right, and you'll notice that coinage we just looked at was around that time. So just after that coinage was minted, the Persian army snuck in through that secret entrance they discovered. You might think, okay, well, they'll patch it up after that point. Well, the same thing happened again about 400 years later, where the city was laid siege to, this time by a king named Antiochus. Or an attacker named Antiochus, and he laid siege to the city, found the secret entrance, and came in. And both of these attacks came during the nighttime. Why do I say that? Well, why do I bring that up? Well, you'll notice that Jesus gives a pretty stern warning to Sardis. He says, "Wake up and strengthen the things which remain and which were about to die. I've not found your deeds completed in the sight of my God. So remember what you've received and heard, and keep it and repent. Therefore," he says, "if you do not wake up," and this is where it links in with this attack on Sardis. "Therefore, if you do not wake up, I will come like a thief, and you will not know at what hour I will come to you." The people who lived in Sardis were well aware of this history in the city, and so they would have understood. He was saying, hey, our city got overtaken. We thought we were safe. Our city got overtaken by this attack in the night. And so they would understand that Jesus is telling them, look, you think you're safe, but you're not. He says in verse 1, he says, "I know your deeds, that you have a name that you're alive, but you're dead." So why would Jesus say something like that you have a name that you're alive, but you're dead? Well, what we find in Sardis is that it's well known for its gymnasium. You might think that's weird, like a school is known for a gymnasium, but this is, it's a gym, a place where people would. There's an area for baths. There's an area for working out, and back then, the Romans wouldn't put on clothes after they took a bath to go work out, and so there's this gymnasium in Sardis that is so big it's about 5 acres in size. These are all pictures of the gymnasium in Sardis. Right, and so this was a major influence in the city, a major hub in the city, and what was located right across the street from this gymnasium, it was there were shops on the side. We'll get back to those, but right across the street was the synagogue. This is an odd place for a synagogue. Number one, because you've got this place where there's rampant nudity going on. And they would obviously see that. So who would put a congregation there? And also that would mean the synagogue was in the middle of the city. And usually synagogues were kind of pushed to the outskirts, right? But the synagogue is in the middle of the city, and that really gets at the problem that Jesus is highlighting in Sardis, is they had incorporated themselves into society. Let's go back and look at, here we've got the gymnasium, and then attached to it, you see these little booths, like I was saying, last week, I think, like denials, right? So they have these little booths, and I didn't get a picture of it, but one of these booths they found when they uncovered had a Christian cross on it. Now, what that meant was someone was claiming to be a Christian, but in order to have a booth here, you would have to offer to the gods, right, of that marketplace. You'd have to offer incense. You'd have to acknowledge them as gods. And so at least one Christian who was a member of the congregation there had set up for profit and claimed to be a Christian, but then also acknowledged gods. And so this, in addition to the proximity of the synagogue with this gymnasium, leads us to conclude that the congregation at Sardis had integrated themselves with society to the point that that they no longer drew a distinction between society and the church there. They had given up on the core message of the gospel. I'd like to read over in John chapter 10 and then 14. John chapter 10 and verses 7 through 9. John chapter 10, verses 7 through 9. Jesus says, "Truly, truly, I say to you, I am the door of the sheep. All who came before me are thieves and robbers, but the sheep did not hear them. I am the door. If anyone enters through me, he will be saved. He will go in and out and find pasture. The thief comes only in to kill and destroy. I came that they may have life and have it abundantly." Right? So Jesus sets himself up as the door of the sheep, as the only way. Let's turn to John chapter 14 and verse 6. Jesus said to him, "I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father but through me." You can't be a Christian and say that Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life, and nobody comes to the Father except through him, and then go into a marketplace and say, "Yeah, I offer to this God, I acknowledge this other God," right? It's a contradictory message. And so that's why Jesus doesn't commend Sardis for any of their works. You notice he doesn't say your works are great and they're increasing, you have your teaching in the right place. He just says, "I know your deeds. Here's your deeds. You have a name that you're alive, but you're dead." So basically, the only good thing in the congregation he saw was they had the name of being Christians, but they're dead inside, he says. Right? And this spiritual death was an indicator that their works, their behaviors weren't in line with the teachings of Jesus, indicating dead faith. Let's turn over to James chapter 2. You may have thought of this when we read that Jesus said you are alive, but you're dead, right? How can someone be alive and dead at the same time? Well, James tells us this. James chapter 2 and starting in verse 14. "What use is it, my brethren, if someone says he has faith but has no works? Can that faith save him? If a brother or sister is without clothing and in need of daily food, and one of you says to them, 'Go in peace, be warmed and be filled,' yet you do not give them what's necessary for their body. What use is that? Even so, their faith, if it has no works, is dead, being by itself. Right? So Jesus is writing to a congregation that has dead faith. He says, I know your deeds, that you have a name that you're alive, but you're dead. But he says there is still hope, right? He says in verse 4, there are a few people in Sardis who have not soiled their garments. There are a few people who have not soiled their garments, and they will walk with me in white, for they are worthy. Why would Jesus, what's the big deal with white clothing, right? That it's harder to maintain. What white clothing meant back then was when a general came back from battle, those who were on that general's side, or when a champion celebrated victory, their followers would put on white robes to indicate that they were on the side of the champion. They were on the winner's side. You might think of it today like how, when a team wins the Super Bowl, you see everybody wear that team's jersey, right? They wear the Super Bowl colors of that team. And so it's kind of that same idea, is when a champion came back from battle, they would wear white robes to celebrate with the champion. So Jesus is saying, look, there's some of you who are still on my side, even though you're in this society or you're in a congregation that has tried to integrate itself so much with society that there's barely distinction. He says, you haven't soiled your robes. And he says, he who overcomes will thus be clothed in white garments. I will not erase his name from the book of life. I will confess his name before my Father and before his angels. Now, Jesus says this about writing their name in the book of life, because back then what they would do is they would keep a city ledger to determine who was a citizen of that city and who wasn't. And so when they would take a census, they would write down the name of everybody in the town. And when someone died, they would remove their name from the ledger. When someone committed a crime against the state, they would remove their name from the ledger. And that meant you're no longer a citizen. You're no longer a part of our city. And so these Christians that had not soiled their garments, that were good Christians in a bad congregation, he says, I will write your names in the book of life. You may be outcast from the marketplace. You may be outcast from society because you hold to the truth. But he says, I will write your names in the book of life, right? So he talks about their citizenship being in heaven rather than their citizenship being here in Sardis. Okay, so Sardis, if we wanted to summarize it, Sardis is a congregation that has tried to integrate so much with society that they really lost their identity. And so he says, some haven't soiled their garments. I'll write your name in the book of life. Let's talk about Philadelphia, right? So continuing around this road, we've got Philadelphia that, judging by the distance, is about 10 miles from Sardis. Let's read verses 7 through 13. To the angel or messenger of the church in Philadelphia write, he who is holy, who is true, who has the key of David, who opens and no one will shut, and shuts and no one will open, says this, I know your deeds. Behold, I put before you an open door which no one can shut, because you have a little power and have kept my word, and have not denied my name. Behold, I will cause those of the synagogue of Satan, who say they're Jews, and they're not, but lie. I will make them come and bow down at your feet. I will make them know that I have loved you. Because you have kept the word of my perseverance, I will also keep you from the hour of testing, the hour which is about to come upon the whole world to test those who dwell on the earth. I'm coming quickly. Hold fast what you have, so that no one will take your crown. He who overcomes, I will make him a pillar in the temple of my God, and he will not go out from it any more. I will write on him the name of my God, and the name of the city of my God, the New Jerusalem, which comes down out of heaven from my God, and my new name. He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. So there's something missing in the letter that Jesus writes to Philadelphia. The thing that's missing is, but I have this against you. He doesn't say that. There was one other congregation, Smyrna, that he wrote to, and he said, he didn't say, but I have this against you, right? So Philadelphia is on the right path, but they're struggling with something. What they're struggling with is acceptance. They're struggling against what he calls the synagogue of Satan in verse 9. He says, I will cause those of the synagogue of Satan who say they're Jews and are not, but lie. I will make them come and bow down at your feet. So what was the synagogue of Satan? Well, to understand that, I think what we need to understand is the nature of Judaism at this time. Right? Usually, reading the New Testament, we try and say, well, there's like Christians, and then there's Jews, or Christians and Judaism, and it was just kind of one or the other, and then there's the pagans, right? The Romans that had no religion or served false gods. But really, there were a lot of subgroups within Judaism. Right? When we talk about the Pharisees, the leaders at the time, those were a subgroup within Judaism. There was the Sadducees, and that was another subgroup within Judaism. You remember, my mind is going faster than my words will. You remember that Paul actually caused a fight or a dispute between the Pharisees and Sadducees because they were subgroups within Judaism that disagreed over the resurrection or the afterlife. There was also the Essenes, the Herodians, the Zealots, and each of these are different subgroups within Judaism that still followed the Old Testament, still subscribed, and so when Christians came along, they kind of just put Christians at the end of the list. They said, okay, well, yeah, now we've got a group called Christians too. They're Jews who follow this guy named Jesus. Let's look in Acts chapter 24. Acts chapter 24, and we'll read verse 14. Where Christianity is called a sect of Judaism. Acts chapter 24 and verse 14. This is Paul speaking. He says, "But this I admit to you, that according to the way, which they call a sect, do I serve the God of our fathers." He's referring to Christianity, and he calls it, he says, look, it's referred to as a sect. This is likely something that was going on within the city at Philadelphia, right? Is they had some subgroups, and he says one of those subgroups was the synagogue of Satan. So does that mean that it's like a Jewish group that is somehow worshiping Satan? Well, no, that would just be ridiculous because the Old Testament clearly condemns that and speaks against it. Here's what I think he is talking about. Let's turn over to John chapter 8. Right, because Jesus, we know the scriptures are self-consistent. Jesus is self-consistent. And so let's see how he speaks to some Jewish leaders in John chapter 8. John chapter 8, and we'll start reading in verse 39. And here Jesus is going to speak to them, and I think what he's going to get at is the core idea of a Jewish subgroup being the synagogue of Satan. Right, so let's see how he connects the dots. John chapter 8, and we're kind of picking up in the middle of a conversation, but they answered and said to him, "Abraham is our father," right? So this Jewish group he's talking to, they say, "Abraham is our father," right? We have a claim to being God's people because we're descended from Abraham. Jesus said to them, "If you're Abraham's children, do the deeds of Abraham. But as it is, you're seeking to kill me, a man who has told you the truth, which I heard from God. This Abraham did not do. You're doing the deeds of your father." Right? So he says, they're doing the deeds of their father because you can tell by how they're acting. They said to him, "We're not born of fornication. We have one Father, God." Right? So Abraham's our father. Well, no, actually, God's our father. Jesus said to them, "If God were your father, you would love me." Right? Again, getting back to their behavior, right? How they're acting. "If God were your father, you would love me, for I proceeded forth and have come from God, for I have not even come on my own initiative, but he sent me. Why do you not understand what I'm saying? It's because you cannot hear my word." Right? So they're claiming they're God's people. They're claiming we're from God, we're from Abraham, right? And you can kind of, I picture the tears in their eyes as they're saying, no, you're wrong, right? But Jesus gets to his point in verse 44. He says, "You are of your father, the devil. You want to do the desires of your father. He was a murderer from the beginning and does not stand in the truth because there's no truth in him. Whenever he speaks a lie, he speaks from his own nature, for he is a liar and the father of lies. But because I speak the truth, you do not believe me. Which one of you convicts me of sin? If I speak the truth, why do you not believe me? He who is of God hears the words of God. For this reason, you do not hear them, because you are not of God." Right? And then back in verse 44, remember he said, "You are of your father, the devil." And he's speaking to Jewish people who probably for their whole lives had followed God or thought they were following God. But he says your behavior is different. And this is likely what the congregation in Philadelphia was struggling with when he called it a synagogue of Satan. It's not a synagogue that was there to worship Satan, but it was a synagogue that was claiming to do what's right, claiming to do the truth, claiming to follow the truth, But really, they were following Satan because they were trying to stamp out what really is true, which is the message of the gospel, right? The Christians would affirm Jesus as Lord, and those Jewish people there, what he calls the synagogue of Satan, would try and stamp it out. And so, like the devil, their father, they would speak lies. Those lies being that Jesus is not God's son. Those lies being Jesus is not Lord, right? That's what they would say. And so they would attribute the Christians' good works as evil works against them. So Jesus is writing to the church at Philadelphia to reassure them, right? Again, there's nothing wrong with what they're doing. They're just in a bad place. And so he's writing to reassure them that they are in the right place, they are doing the right thing, and they are securely his. And so that's why his message is a lot about acceptance, right? Is because they're in a society, or even, it's not just the idolatrous society, right? But the Jewish people who are supposed to be serving the same God as they are, they're outcast. They're making the Christians outcast. And I forgot to mention too, what would happen is if you were in a synagogue and then you came out as a Christian, or you said you were a Christian, what they would do is they would remove your name from the membership list of the synagogue. And you might think, well, big deal, right? But that membership list was the list of people who didn't have to say Caesar is Lord. And so if your name was not on the synagogue list, then you were on the list of people who had to claim Caesar as Lord. Otherwise, you would be killed. Otherwise, you'd be put in prison. And so expulsion from the synagogue of Satan, right? Expulsion from that synagogue was a death sentence if you kept to Christianity. And so that's why let's read over it again, because you see Jesus speaks a lot to including those Christians and to safety for those Christians. He introduces himself as the one who is holy and true. Right, those characteristics he describes in John chapter 8. And he says, who opens and no one will shut, who shuts and no one opens, right? So he's saying, I am the door. I give access. No one can shut you off from me. Even if your name is removed from the synagogue registry, he says, I will let you in. And then he says to them, this is a promise he makes to them that he didn't make to Smyrna. Remember, Smyrna was a congregation that were good Christians in a bad place. He didn't have anything to say against them. And he says, some of you are going to have to die because of your faith. What Jesus says here to the church of Philadelphia, he says, because you have kept the word of my perseverance, I will also keep you from the hour of testing, that hour which is about to come upon the whole world to test those who dwell on the earth. So Jesus excuses them from that testing. And he describes himself as having the key of David. This is a reference to a prophecy that was made about the coming Messiah back in Isaiah chapter Isaiah chapter 22. That the coming king. It was a prophecy where Eliakim, which he became prime minister to replace someone named Shebna, who had a lot of power, or was very power hungry in the crowd. And so what the key of David meant was it was replacing those who kind of held the power with someone who is truly God's servant. And so Jesus introduces himself as the one who has the key of David, saying, look, I'm going to take you who have been expelled from the synagogue and excluded from the life that it affords you. He's saying, I will come and I will give you access. And so it's especially powerful how he phrases them, right? To him who overcomes. How does he talk to them who overcome? To those who stick with the message of the cross that Jesus is Lord. He says, I will make you, in verse 12, he who overcomes, I will make him a pillar in the temple of my God, and he will not go out from it anymore, right? Because they've been kicked out of the synagogue. I will not go out from it anymore. I will write on him the name of my God, the name of the city of God, the New Jerusalem, which comes down out of heaven from my God, and my new name, right? So the one who gives access, he will make them a pillar in the temple. And we don't really build with pillars anymore. What he might say is, I will make you a support beam in my temple, right? It's a component of the temple that cannot be removed. Because if you go to one of these old structures, I don't recommend it, and you push one of the temple or one of the pillars out, right, it'll fall over. Because that's the support structure. It's an irreplaceable piece of the building. And so Jesus says, I'm going to make you an irreplaceable piece in my building, in my church. So that's how he speaks to Philadelphia, right? People who were being excluded, but who were his. And so then last we get to Laodicea. And Laodicea, remember, Ephesus was a very wealthy city. Laodicea concludes this trade route and actually was the gateway to go out to Babylon. And I'm looking at the wrong handout. So Laodicea had a problem that is very prevalent in the United States. Laodicea had a problem with money. Here's the reason why. Let's read first. So Revelation 3, starting in verse 14. To the angel of the church in Laodicea write, the Amen, the faithful and true witness, the beginning of the creation of God, says this: I know your deeds, that you're neither cold nor hot. I wish that you were cold or hot. So because you're lukewarm and neither hot nor cold, I will spit you out of my mouth. Because you say, I'm rich and have become wealthy and have need of nothing, and you do not know that you're wretched and miserable and poor and blind and naked. I advise you to buy from me gold refined by fire, so that you become rich, and white garments, so that you may clothe yourself, and that the shame of your nakedness will not be revealed, and eye salve to anoint your eyes, so that you may see. Those whom I love I reprove and discipline. Therefore be zealous and repent. Behold, I stand at the door and knock. If anyone hears my voice and opens the door, I will come into him and will dine with him and he with me. He who overcomes, I will grant him to sit down with me on my throne, as I also overcame and sat down with my Father on his throne. He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. All right, so this is the last city. It's the city of Laodicea. And if I'm not going to read it right now, but if you go to Colossians chapter 4, near the end of the book of Colossians, Paul wrote a letter there. He tells them, hey, share it with the church at Laodicea, right? So the church there is mentioned. And he does this because Laodicea was kind of coupled to two neighboring cities. There is a city, Hierapolis, and a city, Colossae. Hierapolis had hot springs, and people would go there for these soothing hot springs to be healed. And Colossae had refreshing, clean water that was used for drinking. And they built canals because Laodicea naturally didn't have any water of its own. They built canals from Hierapolis and Colossae. But the catch was, by the time the hot spring water from Hierapolis got to Colossae, it had cooled off and it was just kind of room temperature or outside temperature. Then the water in Colossae that was cool and refreshing, by the time it got to Laodicea, it was also just kind of water, right? And so that's why he says to them, because you're neither lukewarm, neither hot nor cold, I will spit you out of my mouth. Now we can try and read into, okay, what's hot, what's cold, but really Jesus is just making a reference to, hey, you know how the water in Hierapolis is so soothing and useful, and the water in Colossae is so refreshing, right? That water has a purpose. By the time it gets to you, it's lost its purpose. And that's what he's talking to the congregation about, is you've really lost your purpose, right? Laodicea was actually a very wealthy city. So wealthy, in fact, that when disaster came to the city, let's see, an earthquake hit Laodicea in about AD 30. They refused help from the Roman Empire. Rome was ready to send money to help Laodicea, and they said, no, we don't need it. We can take care of ourselves, right? And so they did. They rebuilt the city. But we see that attitude reflected in what Jesus writes to them. He says, you say, I'm rich and have become wealthy and have need of nothing. But he says, you don't realize you are, he says, you're wretched and miserable and poor and blind and naked. So they were kind of the opposite of Smyrna. To Smyrna, he writes, he says, I know your poverty, but you're rich, right? You're spiritually rich, even though physically you're poor. Here to Laodicea, he says that you are spiritually poor, right? You think you're rich, but you're poor. And that's because they are in a city that where pride in money, pride in finances has overtaken them. And the reason why this attitude is so dangerous, right, in the United States today, and why this attitude was so dangerous back in, is it's this attitude of self-sufficiency, right? I can do everything on my own, right? But the core message of the gospel is opposite to that. The core message is Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. He is the door where we gain access to the Father and no other, right? So we can't earn our way into heaven. We can't earn our way back to the Father. And so this attitude of pride, of we can do it on our own, that was corrupting the church at Laodicea so much that they had just removed the core message of the gospel, apparently, from their teaching. So what was behind that was their reliance on money, on treasure, on possession. And let's turn over to Luke chapter 12. Luke chapter 12. Right, he didn't write this to the congregation, but I think he could have. Luke chapter 12, and let's listen to the parable of the rich man, and we'll see. Yeah, I think it matches up pretty well with the attitude that was there in Laodicea. Luke 12 and verse 16. He told them a parable, saying, "The land of a rich man was very productive, and he began reasoning to himself, saying, 'What shall I do, since I have no place to store my crops?' Then he said, 'This is what I'll do. I'll tear down my barns and build bigger ones, and there I'll store my grain and my goods. And I'll say to my soul, Soul, you have many goods laid up for many years to come. Take your ease, eat, drink, and be merry.'" And that's the end. No, that's not. "But God said to him, 'You fool, this very night your soul is required of you, and now who will own what you've prepared? So is the man who stores up treasure for himself and is not rich toward God.'" That was the issue there at Laodicea. And I forgot to read verses 33 and 34, but he drives the point home there, so let's go back and read that. Luke chapter 12, verse 33, "Sell your possessions and give to charity. Make yourselves money belts which do not wear out, an unfailing treasure in heaven, where no thief comes near or moth destroys, for where your treasure is, there will your heart be also." And I think that's the plea that Jesus is making to the church at Laodicea is don't let your treasure lie in your wealth. Don't let your security lie in your wealth, right? Which is something that we do sometimes here in a capitalist society, right? It just kind of, probably like Laodicea had, right? You're around it, you hear it a lot. You hear it, from the news, you hear it from your friends, and it just kind of is this mindset that gets in that, oh yeah, money can solve my problems. It's interesting because there was someone who had a lot of money named Rockefeller, right? He had, some argue, the top 5 wealth in the history of the world. And so someone asked him, how much money is enough? I don't know if you had heard this before, but his answer was very short, very to the point. He said, the answer to how much money is enough, he said, is a little bit more, right? That's the answer, a little bit more. And what that gets at is the insatiable desire for money. But we got to ask, why is money so important to us, right? You can't really keep yourself warm with it. You can't really eat it, right? So why is money so important? And what I think it is money gives us the promise, but doesn't deliver, of what Jesus provides, right? Security, safety, happiness, right? That's what money claims it can offer us. And you see people who put their reliance on money, who think money is a safe haven, and then in times of market downturn, in times where thieves come in, times where storms come in and wipe everything out, right? Then they really find out, oh, money didn't keep its promise. But God does. God gives us security and happiness that cannot be taken away. And that's the message Jesus is trying to tell the people of Laodicea is, look, you've got your security in your wealth, but that can go away, right? Thieves can break in and steal. It can be corrupted, right? But he says, and so he speaks to them in marketplace terms, right? This is something we try and do is speak to people on their level, speak to people in their own terms. And so he says in verse 18, back in Revelation 3, he says, "I advise you to buy from me gold and silver, gold refined by fire, so that you may become rich," right? So Jesus isn't trying to get them to buy a different kind of gold. What he's saying is, what you're really looking for, the wealth, the regality that you're looking for, it's found in me, not anywhere else, right? Jesus is the solution. Like we talked about, Jesus is the door of the sheep. He is the way, the truth, and the life. And thankfully, history tells us that the church there did heed his words. He he says, I will allow you in. He says, behold, I stand at the door and knock. If anyone hears my voice and opens the door, I will come into him and will dine with him and he with me. Right? So Jesus says this. So did they open the door? Well, what history tells us is that they did. Because excavation sites around Laodicea have uncovered about 20 different churches, 20 different congregations that were in that area. And so they did heed his words. They did give up on their materialism to follow him. Right? And so if we step back and look at Revelation 1 through 3, the core message that Jesus is teaching there is it is not the Roman Empire. It is not idolatry. It's not society. It's not money that gives us happiness, that gives us value, that we should rely on, that we should worship. He's saying it is Jesus. Jesus is the King. He is Lord. And he is the one that we should devote ourselves to, that we should worship. And so that was the message. He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. What the Spirit is saying, in summary, is Jesus is Lord. Jesus is King. Jesus is God's Son. And if you don't believe that, you are aligning yourselves with society. You're aligning yourselves against him. But Jesus is the one who will be victorious. So if you have struggled with materialism, like the church at Laodicea, if you've struggled with blending yourself into society, we're going to sing a song now. If you've struggled with those things and find yourself losing your Christian identity, then please come up to the front while we stand and sing.